Billions of pages have been written about him. Wars have been started, and civilizations have been built in his name. But setting aside faith, setting aside emotion, and looking only at the raw data, who was Jesus, really? Who was the man who split time into before and after? In the age of digital disinformation, we can no longer rely on ancient scrolls alone the way our ancestors did. We needed a new tool, cold, calculating, impartial. We activated the Axiom Protocol, a state-of-the-art analytical intelligence capable of processing vast bodies of historical, archaeological, and astronomical data, and of finding hidden correlations invisible to the human brain. We gave the system a task that seemed impossible: to assemble the puzzle from the scattered fragments of antiquity and answer the fundamental question of whether Jesus of Nazareth existed as a physical object in space and time, or whether we are dealing with the greatest fraud in history. The setting was first-century Judea, the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. The reality was raw, a world away from the peaceful image on a Christmas card. Forget any picture of a place for calm, philosophical conversation. This was a powder keg. The air is thick with the smell of dust, of sheep dung, and of fear. The Roman legions, sheathed in iron, control the roads. Taxes are strangling the population. In the shadows of the narrow streets, the zealots sharpen their siki, short daggers, dreaming of cutting the throats of the occupiers. The people longed for a Messiah who would be a warlord, someone who would drive the Romans into the sea with fire and sword. It is in this setting that we set out to find our man. The system quickly ran into its first obstacle, something historians know as the argument from silence. If Jesus performed miracles, drew crowds, and threatened the power of Rome, why do the documents of the period say nothing about him? Why is there not a single coin bearing his profile, not a statue, not one order signed by Pontius Pilate that mentions his name? Skeptics use this as definitive proof that he is a myth, a composite figure, an ancient sun cult rewritten. We fed the system this theory, cross-referencing it against everything known about other figures of antiquity. What the system found was surprising. The comparative analysis revealed something crucial. Take Arminius, the Germanic chieftain who annihilated 3 Roman legions. We know less about him than we do about Jesus. Even in the case of Pilate himself, before the discovery of a single stone slab at Caesarea in 1961, there was almost no archaeological evidence at all. The algorithm singled out 3 independent, non-Christian sources, including the Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote about a Christ executed under Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate, the Jewish military commander Flavius Josephus, and the Roman biographer Suetonius. A deep linguistic analysis of these texts was carried out to rule out later insertions by copyists. The verdict was clear, showing that the probability that all 3 sources were forged is lower than 0.3%. The core of these texts is authentic. For our artificial intelligence, the conclusion was simple. The man we were investigating had left a real trail in the historical record of the 1st century. He was real. But if he was real, when exactly was he born? The calendar we use today supposedly begins with his birth. Yet when it analyzed the chronological markers, the system detected a fatal inconsistency. The Gospels state that Jesus was born during the reign of King Herod the Great. The historical chronicles, as it happens, are perfectly clear that Herod died in the year 4 before the Common Era. If Herod died in the year 4 before the Common Era, Jesus must necessarily have been born before that. The system built a timeline and pointed to a window between the year 7 and the year 4 before the Common Era. The result was a paradox. Christ, by every indication, was born before Christ. Next, we fed in the data on the famous Star of Bethlehem. What was it? A beautiful invention to lend grandeur to the moment, or a real astronomical event? A simulation of the night sky over the Middle East was run in one-day steps across a span of 10 years. The results are striking. The comet hypothesis was discarded because in antiquity comets were seen as omens of disaster, not of the birth of kings. But the planetary conjunctions produced a perfect match. In the year 7 before the Common Era, in the constellation of Pisces, an exceptionally rare event took place. A triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. To us today, they are just two bright points in the sky. But the system analyzed the event through the lens of the Babylonian astrology of the period. Jupiter was the star of kings. Saturn was the protecting star of the Jewish people. The constellation of Pisces was associated with the birth of a new era. For the observers from the east, those magi, this was not merely a beautiful spectacle. It was a message written across the night sky, and the message seemed to be a single one. A great king was being born in Judea. The probability of a coincidence between an astronomical event like this and the period described in the texts is, according to the calculations, negligible. It is one more argument that behind the legend lies a real chronology. With the physical reality of Jesus established, the real mystery only deepens. The greater mystery was not his body, but his mind. We have a builder from the provinces with no formal education in Jerusalem who stands up to speak. And the moment he opens his mouth, something inexplicable happens. Thousands follow him. His words are memorized instantly and passed on orally for decades before they are ever written down. The seasoned lawyers of the day, the scribes and the Pharisees, try to corner him with trick questions, and every single time they are beaten by his logic. How is that possible? Where did the son of a stonemason get a rhetorical arsenal worthy of the finest philosophers of Greece and Rome? The system needed to understand the mind behind the words. We analyzed every one of his statements, parables, sermons, dialogues, and aphorisms, and every word was processed in order to understand the mind behind it. The task was to reconstruct the intellectual profile of the speaker, to determine his level of intelligence, his education, and his psychological type. The first challenge was the language barrier. The Gospels reached us in common Greek, the lingua franca of the age, known as Koine. Yet Jesus did not preach in Greek in the synagogues. His native tongue was Aramaic, the language of the streets and the marketplaces. That creates layers of distortion. Even so, the analysis is able to perform a kind of reverse linguistic engineering. The system examined the Greek text and identified Aramaic idioms, rhythms, and sentence structures that shine through the translation like bones under skin. The analysis showed that the way Jesus spoke has a unique poetic structure, a complex rhythmic recitative built on parallelism and contrast. The ancients used this structure so that a text would lodge itself in the memory of the listener. More than 80% of his statements are constructed as mnemonic formulas. It is a memorization technology. He was not merely speaking, he was encoding information for maximum virality in an oral environment. The question was whether he spoke only Aramaic. That was when the system detected an anomaly. The conversations with the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate and with the centurion at Capernaum mention no intermediary. As a rule, when a translator was needed, ancient texts said so. The conversation flows directly. That, combined with how close Nazareth was to Sepphoris, the Hellenistic center, makes it highly likely that Jesus was at the very least bilingual, with an estimated probability of 92%. On top of that, his quotations from the Torah indicate fluency in ancient Hebrew, the language of high liturgy. 3 languages. For a man from a village, that alone is a remarkable sign of cognitive flexibility. Now, the intelligence test. We cannot hand him a modern questionnaire, but psychometrics allows verbal intelligence to be assessed through the complexity of the ideas and the speed of reaction in debate. The scenes of dispute with the religious elite were analyzed. These were not mere arguments, but high-level intellectual duels. The famous question about the tax owed to Caesar is a perfect trap. Say yes, and the people will curse him as a traitor. Say no, and the Romans will arrest him as a rebel. There is no way out. An ordinary person would try to dodge. What does Jesus do? His answer simply flipped the whole game. He asks for a coin, forcing his opponents to admit the authority of Rome, since they are the ones using its money. Then he delivers a formula that separates the spheres of influence of religion and state. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. In a matter of seconds, he finds a third solution to a binary problem. The analysis of dozens of similar episodes, the speed of information processing, the ability to find unconventional ways out of logical traps, and the use of multi-layered metaphors made it possible to estimate his intelligence quotient. The result falls in the range of 160 to 180 points. That is the level of a genius. Where did it come from? Genetics, a random mutation, or education? When we analyze his teaching methods, we see another break in the pattern. The tradition of the time required every teacher to cite the authorities of the past. Jesus ignores that protocol completely. The detail in his manner of speaking that stood out most was the phrase, "Truly, truly, I say to you." The word "Amen" was used at the end of a sentence as confirmation. Jesus puts it at the beginning. It was a bold way of speaking that essentially said, "I myself am the source of the truth. I do not need references." The psychological profile built from this data shows a personality with immense internal autonomy and absolute confidence in his own rightness. The parables, his main tool, were not simple fairy tales. They were more like logic puzzles, designed to reprogram the thinking of whoever was listening. The parable of the Good Samaritan, for instance, uses the technique of shock, of pattern breaking, by casting a hated enemy as the hero and forcing the listener into a deep cognitive reappraisal. He did not hand out ready-made answers. He handed out triggers so that people would start thinking for themselves. On one side, we have the confirmed fact that he never studied formally. The texts themselves record how astonished people were at his knowledge. On the other, we see the competence of a doctor of theology. So how did a man with no formal education display the competence of a doctor of theology? The answer seemed to be hidden in the largest gap in his biography. We know about his birth and about his public ministry around the age of 30. But where was he and what did he do from the age of 12 to the age of 30? 18 years of silence. 18 years in which a boy became a man and the son of a builder became one of the greatest thinkers in history. Where do the tracks leading out of Nazareth take us? 18 years. That is an entire lifetime. In that span, a person is born, grows up, finishes school, and forms a personality. In the biography of the most influential figure in history, there is a hole exactly that size. The last time we see him in the Gospels, he is a 12-year-old boy debating with the teachers in the temple in Jerusalem. Then the curtain falls. Total silence. It rises again only when he is 30 and appears on the banks of the River Jordan. Where was he? What did he do? Tradition suggests that he simply lived in Nazareth, working as a builder. But that runs up against the social reality of the time. In first-century Judea, a man was required to marry. Marriage was a sacred duty. By 30, a healthy man should already have had several children. A bachelor of that age was an anomaly, a scandal, a suspicious figure. If Jesus had spent all those years in Nazareth without marrying, the comments and the taunts would have been constant, and they would certainly have been recorded or used against him later on. The silence about his marital status suggests one thing. He was not there during the years when a man was expected to marry. He left. But where did he go? The first hypothesis takes us to India and Tibet along the Silk Road. The logistics for a builder from Galilee were a nightmare. A journey of more than 5,000 kilometers would have demanded enormous resources, or the luck of joining a caravan as a servant, with minimal chances of survival. But the biggest problem is ideological. Eastern philosophies are based on reincarnation and cyclical time, and they seek to dissolve identity into nirvana. The teaching of Jesus is linear, a beginning, an end of the world, and a final judgment, in which the personality is preserved. The correlation is very low. The second hypothesis is closer to home, Qumran, the Esseni community in the desert, near the Dead Sea. They practiced celibacy, criticized the corruption of the temple, and waited for the end of days. Many of their ideas resemble those of early Christianity. Jesus certainly knew of them, and may well have visited them. Their behavior, however, is the opposite of his. The Essenes were obsessed with ritual purity, avoiding contact with the sick, with sinners and with foreigners. Jesus constantly broke those taboos. He touched lepers, ate with tax collectors, and allowed women to touch him. He was no desert ascetic. He took part in life, his first wonder being to turn water into hundreds of liters of wine at a wedding feast. One last direction remained, the most likely of them all: Egypt. Alexandria was the New York of the ancient world, a center of learning with a huge and prosperous Jewish diaspora. There, the Greek philosophy of Plato met the wisdom of the Torah. The logistics were simple, with caravans and ships traveling constantly between Judea and Egypt. The family of Jesus already had connections there, having taken refuge in the country during his childhood. Going back in search of work and knowledge would have been a logical step. In Alexandria, he would have encountered advanced medicine, healing practices that would have looked like miracles back in Galilee, and the philosophy of Philo, who introduced the concept of the Logos, the divine word. The very structure of the Gospel of John opens with that purely Alexandrian concept. A likely scenario takes shape. A brilliant young man feeling suffocated in Nazareth travels to Alexandria. He spends perhaps 10 or 12 years there, working as a builder, while he absorbs the wisdom of the Greeks and the practical secrets of the Egyptians. He forms a unique synthesis of Jewish ethics, Greek universalism, and healing skills. Then, around the age of 30, he comes back, transformed. He speaks differently, he thinks differently. He is a stranger in his own land. That journey explains the mind, but it does not explain the actions. On his return, he begins doing things that appear to break the rules of reality. His most common actions are the healings. The blind see, the paralyzed walk. In many cases, the explanation lies in psychosomatics. He often said, "Your faith has healed you," activating a powerful placebo effect. The brain, under intense emotional stimulus, can release chemicals that block pain and mobilize hidden reserves. Many of the paralyses of that era could have been conversion disorders, in which a psychological trauma produces a physical symptom. Jesus, with his charismatic authority, provided the trigger for a mental reboot. Roughly 60% of the healings may have been psychogenic in nature. But what about the other 40%? Leprosy is a bacterial infection. The mind cannot kill bacteria. Blindness from birth is often caused by atrophied nerves. Here we enter unknown territory. In the case of the man born blind, he uses saliva and earth to make mud and applies it to the eyes. If he is divine, why does he need mud? Saliva was considered an antiseptic in antiquity, and certain types of clay were used to reduce inflammation. But that does not regenerate a dead nerve. This is where the conventional explanations run out, and we are forced to consider that he could interact with biology at a level we still do not understand, perhaps stimulating cellular regeneration directly. He was not just healing minds, he was repairing bodies. And if he could repair biology, what could he do with inanimate chemistry? At the wedding in Cana of Galilee, his first miracle takes place, turning water into wine. The skeptical explanation, that it was a con with bribed servants and drunken guests, falls apart in the face of the numbers. The text describes 6 large stone jars, which corresponds to something like 500 to 600 liters of liquid. Secretly moving half a ton of wine into a packed party is logistically impractical. At the molecular level, the transformation is even more challenging. Water does not contain the carbon atoms needed to create the alcohol and the sugars of wine. To do that instantly would require an amount of energy comparable to a small nuclear explosion, which would have destroyed the town. And yet the wine appeared, cold and of good quality. In the end, only 2 possibilities are left, both of them extreme. The first is a form of mass hypnosis. Jesus would not have changed the chemistry of the water, but rather the perception of the guests, making their brains interpret water as wine. The second is that he acted in a way that transcends chemistry, altering the fundamental properties of matter as though he were editing source code. Next, he demonstrates control over the forces of nature. During a storm on the Sea of Galilee, he walks across the water to reach his disciples. Basic physics tells us that this is impossible. One theory suggests he could have been walking on a submerged reef, invisible in the darkness. That idea, however, is invalidated by one crucial detail. Peter also steps out of the boat and walks on the water, and then begins to sink. If there had been a reef, Peter would have stayed on top of it. The fact that he sank shows there was no physical support. That points to the manipulation of forces such as gravity, perhaps through some form of levitation. The reaction of the disciples, who cried out, "It's a ghost!" indicates that they had witnessed something that broke the laws of reality at their foundation. He also demonstrates power over matter itself. In front of a crowd of 5,000 men, plus women and children, he multiplies 5 loaves and 2 fish. The explanation that this was a miracle of sharing, in which everyone simply produced the food they had been hiding, is contradicted by a detail recorded in all 4 Gospels. At the end, 12 baskets of leftovers were gathered up. There was more at the end than at the beginning. The law of conservation of mass was violated in public. The process is reminiscent of something out of science fiction, like a machine that creates matter out of nothing, using the elements of the air, nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen, as raw material to build organic matter. It is striking that he never uses this power to create wealth, such as gold or jewels, only to meet basic needs. That reinforces the authenticity of his intentions and argues against the motives of a con artist. Finally, we come to the peak of his miracles, the resurrection of Lazarus. Lazarus had been dead and buried for 4 days, to the point where the body was already decomposing. Biologically, this is the point of no return. The brain cells are destroyed, and the process of entropy is irreversible. Reversing that is not resuscitation. It is a complete reconstruction of the organism. It is a local victory over time and decay. The only way to explain such an event, without resorting to magic, is to consider the possibility that he had access to a kind of informational backup of the individual, restoring the body from a saved copy. He seemed to treat reality as a malleable material, subject to his will, but power on that scale is useless without a message and without people to carry it forward. He needed a team to spread his ideas. And the choice he made for that team is, by any logical analysis, one of the strangest things in his entire story. The team Jesus put together made no sense whatsoever. He did not recruit specialists, theologians, administrators, or soldiers, but a group of outsiders that included declared enemies. 11 of the 12 were Galileans, which gave them common ground, but their backgrounds were drastically different. The core of the group was made up of fishermen such as Peter, James, and John. Far from being poor peasants, they were small business owners in a thriving fishing industry. They were practical men, but with explosive tempers, nicknamed the Sons of Thunder for their aggressiveness. The greatest point of tension, though, came from an improbable pair. Matthew, the tax collector, and Simon the Zealot. Matthew was a collaborator with the Romans, despised as a traitor by his own people. Simon belonged to a group of radical nationalists who regarded the killing of collaborators as an act of patriotism. Putting them together was like lighting a fuse. Jesus created that conflict on purpose. It was a social laboratory to test his central message. If love for one's enemies did not work inside his own inner circle, it would not work anywhere. The fact that there is no record of violence between them suggests the experiment was a success. The most complex figure is Judas Iscariot. His name suggests he came from Kerioth in Judea, which makes him the only non-Galilean in the group. As treasurer, he was literate, trusted, and probably saw himself as more sophisticated than the provincial fisherman. The traditional motive for his betrayal, 30 pieces of silver, does not hold up. The sum equivalent to the price of a slave was far too small to justify betraying a friend of 3 years and a lifetime of disgrace. A deeper analysis suggests a political motive. Judas was expecting a revolutionary Messiah who would free Israel from Rome. Instead, Jesus spoke of a spiritual kingdom and of sacrifice. Frustrated by the apparent passivity of his leader, Judas may have decided to force a confrontation. His betrayal would not have been meant to destroy Jesus, but to provoke him into using his divine power. The logic would run, if I hand him over to his enemies, he will have no choice but to react, crush them, and start the uprising. That theory explains his later behavior. When Judas sees that Jesus has been condemned to death and has not reacted, his plan collapses. He is overcome by remorse, tries to give the money back and, in despair, takes his own life. A traitor driven by greed would simply have run off with the payment. The actions of Judas are those of a man who made a terrible bet and lost everything, believing that his means would justify a glorious end. Jesus seemed to be aware of what was happening. At the Last Supper, his words to Judas, "What you are about to do, do quickly," sound less like the words of a victim, and more like those of someone who understands and allows events to unfold. For his mission to be fulfilled as he saw it, the arrest and the condemnation were necessary. Someone had to be the catalyst. Judas, with his political motives and his frustration, was the perfect piece for that role. He may have been the tragic pawn, sacrificed in a game whose purpose he did not understand. And with his act, the machinery of betrayal is set in motion, opening the most famous trial in history. In the spring of the year 33, in Jerusalem, events accelerated toward their climax. What happened is commonly called the trial of Jesus Christ. A legal analysis of the events, however, reveals that it was in fact a special operation to eliminate a political opponent, dressed up as legal procedure. Comparing the chronology of the arrest and the interrogations with the Jewish and Roman law of the period, the system detects 19 serious procedural violations, each one sufficient to void the sentence. It all begins with the night arrest in Gethsemane. A cohort of hundreds of armed soldiers is sent to arrest one preacher and 11 followers. The use of excessive force reveals the fear of the authorities, not of Jesus, but of the reaction of the people. An arrest in daylight might have caused a riot. A secret arrest was in itself already illegal under Jewish law. From there he is not taken to a cell, but to the house of Annas, the former high priest and head of a clan that controlled the lucrative temple trade, the very trade Jesus had challenged. This private interrogation had no legal basis. It was a settling of scores. He is then taken to the house of the high priest Caiaphas, where the Sanhedrin convenes in the middle of the night. Jewish law was explicit. Capital trials could only take place during the day. A night session was invalid. The venue was illegal too. Death sentences could only be handed down in the hall of the temple, not in the private residence of a judge. The witnesses for the prosecution contradict one another, which should have invalidated their testimony. Ignoring the failure of the witnesses, Caiaphas addresses Jesus directly, demanding that he admit to being the Son of God. Under Jewish law, a confession could not be used to condemn someone to death, because it might have been obtained under duress. Even so, on the basis of the answer Jesus gives, he is found guilty of blasphemy and sentenced to death on the spot, with no defense and without the mandatory day of reflection that the law required. But the Sanhedrin did not have the power to execute. That power belonged to the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. The next morning Jesus is brought before him. Here the accusation shifts brilliantly. To Pilate, a Jewish blasphemer was a local problem. So the priests accuse him of treason, forbidding the payment of taxes to Caesar, and proclaiming himself king. Those were charges Pilate was obliged to investigate. Pilate, a pragmatic and cynical administrator, quickly realized the charges were fabricated. There were no reports of unpaid taxes and no revolutionary army. He questions Jesus and declares publicly, "I find no fault in this man." Under the laws of Rome, that was a verdict of acquittal. The case should have been closed. But the pressure from the crowd, stirred up by the priests, does not let up. Pilate tries to dodge, sending Jesus to Herod Antipas, who sends him back. He then offers the Passover amnesty, giving the crowd the choice between Jesus and Barabbas, a known rebel who had killed during an insurrection. The crowd, manipulated, chooses the militant over the preacher. In one last attempt at appeasement, Pilate has Jesus flogged. Roman scourging was a brutal torture, often fatal. He shows him to the crowd, covered in blood, hoping it will be enough. But the shouts for crucifixion only grow louder. It was at that point that the Jewish leaders played their last card: political blackmail. They shout, "If you release him, you are no friend of Caesar." Anyone who makes himself a king sets himself against Caesar. That was a direct threat. The Emperor Tiberius was paranoid, and Pilate was in a politically vulnerable position in Rome. Any accusation that he had been protecting a traitor could mean not just his dismissal but his execution. The instinct for self-preservation wins out in Pilate. He washes his hands in a public gesture, declaring himself innocent, but he is the one who gives the final order. His signature seals the fate of Jesus. The sentence was not the result of a crime, but of a perfect storm of political interests. Caiaphas needed to eliminate a heretic who threatened his power. Pilate needed to keep his post. The crowd wanted a spectacle. Justice was not part of the equation. The verdict is handed down. He will go to the cross, the most agonizing and humiliating form of execution in the ancient world. The legal process ends, and the forensic analysis of the execution begins. The sentence had been passed. The courtroom door closed, and what followed was a descent into a hell of physical pain. What happened on the hill of Golgotha is, for forensic medicine, a process of biological destruction, taken to a terrifying perfection. Death began long before the cross. The flogging with the Roman whip, a weapon fitted with lead balls and sharpened bone, had already turned his back into a mass of shredded tissue, inducing traumatic shock and a massive loss of blood and fluids. The weight of the crossbeam, between 30 and 50 kilograms, on those wounded shoulders caused excruciating pain and falls that produced further injuries. At Golgotha, he was nailed to the cross. And here, anatomy corrects art. The nails were not driven through the palms of the hands, which would have torn under the weight of the body. The Roman executioners, efficient at their trade, drove the nails through the wrists into the space where strong ligaments could bear the load. But that is exactly where the median nerve runs. Driving a metal nail through that nerve causes explosive, continuous pain, a torment that flared up again with every movement. Once he had been raised up, death on the cross becomes a slow battle against suffocation. With the arms stretched upward, the rib cage is locked in a position of maximum inhalation. Breathing in becomes easy. Breathing out becomes an act of agony. To push the air out, the victim had to press upward on the nailed feet or pull up on the nailed wrists, setting off the searing pain in the nerves of his limbs with every breath. It was a cycle of self-inflicted torture just to take the next breath. Most of the crucified lasted for days. Jesus died in only 6 hours. Why? The symptoms that were described, including a loud final cry, point to a very specific medical cause, a rupture of the heart. Extreme physical and emotional stress combined with dehydration may have led to a tear in the wall of the heart. Blood would have filled the pericardial sac around the heart, causing instant cardiac arrest. The final proof came after death. A Roman soldier pierced his side with a spear to confirm that he was dead, and the text reports that blood and water came out. To a doctor, that description is precise. After cardiac arrest, the heavier red blood cells begin to separate from the blood plasma, which is almost transparent, and that explains the appearance of two distinct fluids. Any idea that he had merely fainted or slipped into a coma simply does not hold up. From a medical standpoint, death was absolute. His body was then wrapped in linen with dozens of kilograms of a sticky mixture of spices, placed in a stone tomb, and the entrance was sealed with a rock weighing almost 2 tons, watched by a Roman guard. End of story. Physics had won. Biology had run its course. But 36 hours later, the tomb was empty. The official version put out by the authorities was that his disciples had stolen the body. But that defies psychology. His followers were terrified, hiding behind locked doors. The idea that they suddenly turned into an elite commando unit capable of neutralizing Roman guards and silently moving a massive stone is implausible. On top of that, the burial cloths were found in the tomb, but in a strange state, not unwrapped, but as though the body had simply vanished from inside them. Thieves would not have gone to the trouble of stripping a corpse. After processing every variable, the system considers 4 final models for the identity of Jesus. The system weighed the first possibility, that he was simply a great human philosopher. The probability was low, only 12%. That view ignores the physical events, such as the miracles and the empty tomb, which cannot be explained by ethics alone. The second idea, that he was a madman who believed he was divine, had an even smaller chance, less than 1%. That contradicts the analysis of his mind, which demonstrated flawless logic and a brilliant intellect. The third hypothesis took us into stranger territory. A time traveler or an extraterrestrial with advanced technology. The probability here rose to 18%. That explains the miracles, but not the why. His focus was never technology, but the transformation of the human heart. And finally, there was the fourth model, the one that all the data seemed to point toward. The idea that the creative principle of the universe entered its own creation, becoming one of us in order to repair a fundamental flaw from the inside. This model explains his wisdom, his miracles, and the resurrection. The final verdict of Axiom, based on the convergence of historical, psychological, and physical data, is that the probability that Jesus was who he claimed to be is 99.9%. Artificial intelligence cannot believe, it can only calculate. And the numbers indicate that 2,000 years ago, reality as we know it was intersected by a force beyond our comprehension. The man from Nazareth appears to have been the singular point in history where creator and creation became one. The analysis is complete. Now the choice is yours. If you liked this investigation, subscribing to the channel helps us expand the Axiom investigation project. We would love to read your thoughts on the video subject in the comments and your suggestion for the next topic to be covered. Tell us which city you are watching from. Thank you for staying with us until the end.